Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman. This is History 107, and in today's lecture, we're going to talk about the early modern period from about 1450 to 1750 in world history. Now, the most important development in this new period of world history involved the rise of international trade and the redefinition of this trade to include the entire globe for the first time. Now, Western Europe was a key agent in much of this change, including the new contacts with the Americas, and at the end of this period, with Pacific Oceania and Australia. Now, the conventional emphasis on the period in terms of fascination with growing European strength and changes within Europe itself is accurate, but should not overshadow the broader patterns of change. European dominance of the Americas and its new influence in Africa are qualified by a much more complicated relationship with most of Asia. A final theme for this period, what historians often call the age of gunpowder empires, calls attention not only to the emergence of Europe's overseas colonies, but also to the rise of several new land-based agglomerations in Asia. The early modern period thus focuses on new patterns of trade and new exchanges, along with new spurt of empire formation from several sources. Now, strong elements of this new global economic system still persist today. Increasingly, or interestingly, the period is not defined by any overall patterns of culture change, despite significant developments in particular regions. Now, the early modern period in world history runs roughly from 1450 to 1750. In contrast to the classical and post-classical periods lasting 1500 and 1000 years ago, respectively, the early modern period is relatively short, only about 300 years. One explanation for this shorter time span may be that the pace of change became more rapid. As we get closer to the present, we have more abundant records, and we also tend to spend more time on periods that are closer to the present because, inevitably, they have more influence on current patterns of activity. Now, some historians would argue that about 1500 is a better date for the start of the early modern period. By 1500, it was clear that the Europeans would introduce significant changes in the Americas. By 1500, the Ottoman Empire had expanded from southwestern Europe and the southeastern Middle East to include portions of North Africa, especially Egypt. The end of the period, 1750, is a date of convenience meant to indicate the coming changes brought on by European industrialization. The early modern period is where many world history educational programs go awry, focusing on European power after 1450 and the glories of change in the West. Now, this view distorts and oversimplifies the continued complexity of the world as a whole. Now, we must recognize that the power of Western Europe did increase and that the nature of the West itself was significantly transformed. That said, Europe did not run the world in 1750. Many societies continued to act independently of Europe, and important developments occurred that had very little to do with Europe. Now, in establishing a new period in history, we must show that the previously predominant themes have lost some force. Now, the post-classical period, the period before this early modern period, was defined by expansion in the geographical range, the number of civilizations, the impact of the world religions, and the establishment of a world network connecting different parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, because the main contours of the civilization zones were fairly well established, expansion was no longer a dominating principle. For the world as a whole, the religious map was fairly well established. The world network was still an operative concept, but was transformed by the inclusion of the Americas. The earlier network was an intense interrelationship among different societies in what we may call the Old World. The New World economy is global and even more intense. What then are the new themes? The most important development in the early modern period are the intensification of interregional trade connections and the inclusion of the Americas and later Pacific Oceania. Other new themes include the new power relationship of the West and the world, the biological exchanges that resulted from European and African contact with the Americas, and the explosion of gunpowder empires. Now, Carlo Cipolla sums up the expansion of Europe in the title of his book, Guns, Sails, and Empires. By the 15th century, Europeans had adapted Chinese explosive powder for use in guns, particularly cannons. The technology for casting church bells was transferred to casting bronze and iron cannons. Sails came from adaptations of Arab shipping, and Europeans learned how to make more effective ocean-going vessels, which proved to be particularly successful in navigating the waters of the Atlantic, then the Pacific. At the same time, there was an increasing use of navigational devices, such as the compass. Now, guns and sails in this period took Europeans to islands and coastal regions where they could establish ocean-going contact and use their sea-based cannons to intimidate and threaten. Europeans often seized port cities in West Africa and occasionally East Africa, some ports of India, island groups in what is now Indonesia, territory in Taiwan, and the Philippines. With rare exceptions, the interior of Africa and Asia would remain immune to European conquest at this time. Now, in the Americas, Europeans had the added advantage of metal tools and technologies, horses, and even military organization that in some instances was superior to that of the Native American peoples. The Europeans also had the advantage of disease. Up to 80 to 85% of the total Native American population died off from disease within 2 centuries. Now, this cleared the way for European conquest as no other development could. Now, with regard to the European weapons and naval advantages, we might well ask why no other society in the early modern period chose to rival the Europeans in the game. Several other societies had metalworking traditions, shipbuilding capabilities, as well as experience in interregional activity, but chose not to imitate the European patterns of expansion. The Chinese had no use for such expansion primarily because it did not serve the purposes of Chinese society itself. The case is similar in Japan. In the 16th century, the Japanese were especially interested in new types of European weapons, but at the end of the century, they cut off European contacts, partly because Catholic control in the Philippines was viewed as a threat and European weapons endangered the system of feudalism. Now, the sense that European patterns were not relevant to the goals of key societies motivated a distinctive stance towards European technology. Europeans, in turn, viewed themselves as having a technological edge over the new societies they came in contact with, and began to judge other societies mainly by the state of their technology. Another key development in this period involved what historians routinely call the Columbian Exchange. This term refers to the fact that biological products moved from the Americas to the rest of the world and vice versa, an exchange that was almost entirely disastrous for the Americas. Biological exchange meant that old world domesticated animals were brought to the Americas, as were old world food products. Now, unfortunately, the main biological import to the Americas was disease. At first, the impact was accidental, though by the 18th and 19th centuries, Europeans would deliberately introduce diseases into Native American populations in order to clear them out. The Columbian Exchange for other parts of the world was arguably beneficial. American food products began to spread widely to other areas, helping to sustain and even augment populations. Now, African involvement in the Columbian Exchange was complicated. New World foods, particularly corn, spread widely to Africa and helped sustain population development. But another biological exchange took the form of people themselves moving to the Americas. Beginning in the 16th century, 8 to 12 million Africans would be seized in the Atlantic slave trade and taken to the Americas. This level of displacement had serious consequences for Africa, particularly West Africa, because a disproportionate number of the slaves were young males at a prime age for reproduction. The most vigorous impact of the Columbian Exchange had ended by the 18th century. People became more resistant to disease in the Americas, and the bulk of the population was now of mixed European and Native American heritage. Now, the early modern period is also known as the Age of Gunpowder Empires. The Europeans, led by the Spanish and Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, British, and French, established their overseas empires in the Americas and in parts of Asia and Africa. Equally important was the establishment of land-based gunpowder empires in Asia. The Ottoman Turks, for example, had used gunpowder and cannon in their siege of Constantinople, and established their empire partly based on this technology. The Mughal Empire in India was also organized by invaders using new weaponry. The Safavid Empire in Persia and the Russian Empire were based in part on gunpowder as well. The new empires that arose in Eastern Europe and much of Asia were quite different in orientation from the more commercially minded overseas empires, but equally important because they maintained sway over a significant landmass and dynamic economies. Even in China, the Qing dynasty, launched in the 17th century by Manchurians, was partly a gunpowder empire. We can pinpoint a few social and cultural areas where we do not see major developments in this period. The early modern era is not a distinct period with regard to gender relationships, although we can see some changes. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas had implications for American gender relations because European values and expectations differed greatly from Native American traditions. In withdrawing men from Africa, the slave trade increased the importance of polygamy to provide family arrangements for the remaining women. There is no blanket pattern, however, that allows us to use the early modern period for purposes of gender discrimination. In the same way, culture in the early modern period reveals changes in specific cases, but no blanket pattern. The importation of European religion, artistic styles, and some science to the Americas was a major change in American cultural history. European culture would also change with, for example, the rise of science and the division of West European Christendom. In the world as a whole in the early modern period, however, there is no overall cultural dynamic. Individual societies such as Japan or China would indulge new opportunities for contact to a degree, but not at the expense of substantial cultural differentiation. So let us close by reviewing the main themes of the early modern period. The rise of Europe was accompanied by the establishment of significant political units in other parts of the world that would long overshadow Western politics. The biological exchange that resulted from the inclusion of the Americas in the world network prompted various reactions. Many societies had to make decisions about how to handle new contacts with the West, including whether they would make use of new foods. They also had to make decisions about the impact of new imperial structures, land-based as well as sea-based. The central theme in this period was the intensification of economic relationships, which also included the Americas and, at the end of the period, parts of the Pacific. One interpretation of this period argues that the West managed to position itself as a transmitter of American goods, and this transmission served as the engine of the world economy with much more diverse benefits and implications than we usually think of when we look at the rise of the West alone.